Good morning, everybody. My name is Joe Fitzgibbon. I'm a Washington State representative. I represent Washington's 34th legislative district in West Seattle, White Center, Burien, and Vashon and Maury Islands. I also serve as the chair of the House Environment and Energy Committee in our Washington State legislature. And I'm excited to be with you this morning, and I'm excited to brag a little bit about some of the work that we've done in the Washington State legislature to position Washington as one of the nation's leading states on reducing greenhouse gases, fighting climate change, and ensuring a safe climate for current and future generations. You all know well the impacts a changing climate is having on our communities. Of course, in Washington, we experienced by far the hottest temperatures we've ever experienced here. On June 30th of this year, it reached 108 degrees Fahrenheit in Seattle, which is considerably hotter than it's ever been before. But that's not the only extreme weather event that we've experienced. We've seen devastating flooding in the southeastern and northeastern United States. We've seen increased frequency and severity of hurricanes. We, of course, have seen far more severe wildfires in the western United States, including in Washington, than ever before. And it was only just about a year ago that we experienced 2 weeks of hazardous air quality in Washington because of wildfires across Western North America and Eastern Russia. So the impacts of changing climate are not in the future, they are upon us already. And the only silver lining that I can find in that is that it has catalyzed the Washington State legislature to take the most aggressive actions on climate change that we have ever taken in the 2021 legislative session. It's not the very beginning of our climate work. In 2019 and in 2020, we had some important climate breakthroughs. In 2019, we passed the nation's first building performance standard for large commercial buildings, requiring that they reduce their energy use to the most efficient level that they can. We adopted the nation's strongest clean electricity law at that time, requiring that all of our electricity come from non-emitting resources by 2045, with some significant benchmarks along the way, including total phase out of coal power by 2025. And carbon neutral power by 2030. In 2020, we passed some additional important steps, including strengthening Washington's greenhouse gas targets or goals to align with what current science tells us we need to achieve in order to provide for a safe climate into the future, including a goal of net zero emissions across Washington's whole emissions portfolio by 2050. We also adopted new standards requiring more electric vehicles be sold in Washington State. But in 2021 is really the biggest year that we've had yet. And I'm excited to talk to you about the landmark laws that we passed in the 2021 legislative session. First is a law that we passed significantly ratcheting down the use of hydrofluorocarbons. Hydrofluorocarbons are a gas that's one of the most powerful greenhouse gases known to man. It's primarily used in refrigeration. It has some other industrial and chemical applications as well, including as a propellant and a foam blowing agent, but the place that it's in the greatest use is in cooling systems like refrigerators and air conditioners. Washington became the second state after California to require that all air conditioners in our state, phased in by product category starting in 2023, phase out the use of these extremely powerful greenhouse gases and move to more climate safe alternatives, which do exist, but which are not fully on the market yet because we need more states to join Washington and California in requiring the transition to these safer alternatives. That builds on work that we did in 2019 when we required phasing out of these chemicals from refrigerators, particularly large commercial refrigeration systems. Also, as a part of this law, we require that operators of large cooling systems like commercial refrigerators check those systems for leaks, because those leaks are really when hydrofluorocarbons get into the atmosphere. A molecule of a hydrofluorocarbon can be as much as 10,000 times more powerful of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and the global warming potential of that 10,000 times greater impact is heavily front-loaded in early years. So as we look for ways to reduce the immediate impacts of a changing climate, Addressing short-lived climate pollutants like hydrofluorocarbons and methane needs to be a big part of how we, in the near term, avoid the severe weather events that we're seeing increasing frequency and increasing severity over the past couple of years. So that was a great step forward. Another major step forward is a law that I have been working on for many years that we've passed out of the House of Representatives several times, but not quite made it out of the Senate ever until this year. That is a low carbon fuel standard. This is a policy that's already in place in California, in Oregon, and in British Columbia. It requires the largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions in Washington and in most US states, which is transportation fuels used on road, gasoline and diesel in particular, to gradually reduce their greenhouse gas output over time. And it doesn't say how, it doesn't say what technologies we're going to be replacing gasoline and diesel with, although in California and in Oregon, the most successful fuels have been things like renewable diesel produced from canola oil or soybean oil, ethanol produced from corn and from forest waste products, and electricity used to power electric vehicles. All of those technological solutions used for transportation fuel are cleaner than gasoline and diesel. They're all incrementally incentivized by this policy, which requires that the producers of fuels that are dirtier than the standard for that year, which in almost all cases is going to be producers of gasoline and diesel fuel, either clean up their fuel by mixing in alternatives that emit fewer greenhouse gases, or acquire credits from producers of those fuels. So it may be that an oil refinery can mix in more renewable fuels to the blends that they supply to fuel suppliers, or it could be that they go on the market and that they acquire credits from an electric utility or from a biofuel producer or a renewable natural gas producer. This policy has driven enormous innovation in the other jurisdictions that have it in place. It has helped to break the oil industry's monopoly over transportation fuels in those places. And it's a really critical step for us to decarbonize, again, the largest emitting sector in our state, which is on-road transportation fuels. Finally, the policy that really serves as the backstop to all of our other greenhouse gas policies is something we refer to as the Climate Commitment Act. This adopts a firm legal cap on Washington's greenhouse gas emissions. It lowers that cap over time in order to achieve Washington's greenhouse gas targets. And it requires large emitters of greenhouse gases under that cap to acquire allowances from the state for the privilege of emitting greenhouse gases into our air. That means that oil refiners, electric utilities, natural gas utilities, and large industrial manufacturers emitting large quantities of greenhouse gases need to account for the pollution that they emit into our air and need to reduce those over time. The entities that have the easiest time reducing their pollution will have a surplus of allowances that they can provide to those entities that have a harder time reducing their emissions. We know that in some sectors, technological solutions are mature and have arrived, enabling us to produce energy in very low carbon or zero carbon ways. The electricity sector is probably the furthest along on this front. In other sectors, like the industrial sector, those solutions are not necessarily as close at hand. Those sectors will be more in need of allowances into the future than sectors like electricity generation. We expect this program is going to generate a lot of dollars for the state to invest in a transition to the clean energy economy. Because of the auctioning off of those allowances, we think that that could bring in as much as $800 million to $1 billion per year by the time the program begins operation in 2023. So with these three laws, we have in place a policy to phase out the most powerful greenhouse gases known to man. We have a policy to decarbonize the most polluting sector in our state. And we have a backstop policy ensuring that Washington achieves our greenhouse gas targets by capping pollution and reducing the cap over time until we achieve net zero greenhouse gases in the year 2050. Our work is not yet done on climate change. We have much more work to do. We will continue work in the session to come to decarbonize residential buildings, which are the largest sector that we don't. Now that we have a transportation policy in place, residential buildings are now the largest sector where we don't have a policy in place. We have more work to do to integrate greenhouse gas reductions into local governments' land use plans, both in terms of requiring land use plans to reduce those emissions by channeling development into places where the infrastructure exists to support growth and where people have more ability to get around without use of a single occupancy vehicle by utilizing modes like transit and walking and biking. But integrating climate planning into land use planning also involves anticipating a changing climate. Maybe that might mean reduced development in floodplains. That might mean reduced development in areas that are prone to fires, or reducing development in places that are subject to sea level rise. This is an important way for us to reduce the risk to communities that unfortunately won't be avoided because we deferred our taking action on reducing emissions for so long. But a lot of costs can be saved by planning for those impacts and ensuring that development is taking into account those potential impacts in the future. So like I said, our work is not yet done. We will continue to push for climate smart policies in the state of Washington, but our greatest challenge today is to ensure that the great policies that we passed in 2021 are implemented successfully so that other jurisdictions around the United States and around the world will look to Washington as an example for how we can achieve greenhouse gas reductions in a smart, cost-effective way that's supportive of our economies and supportive of the communities most impacted by a changing climate. So thanks again for spending some time hearing about Washington's climate progress today. Thank you for your work helping communities adapt and anticipate the impacts that climate change is delivering to our doorstep in greater number each year. And please hope you'll continue to join me in fighting for the climate progress that we need to keep current and future generations safe. Thanks so much.